Welcome everyone to the Grains for Brewing and Distilling Happy Hour. Today we have Mr. Aaron MacLeod from the Center for Craft Food Beverage at Hartwick College in Oneonta, New York. And what you see here is his first slide, and he's going to, he's going to tell us all about grain quality and mostly about rye, which is very pertinent to what we have going on and to our second session as well. Which was about our rye trials for distilling. So there's a lot of synergy going on here for that. So I'll take up no more of your time. Aaron, welcome and fire away.
Oh, thanks, Ryan. And thanks for the opportunity to talk to you guys today and join in. Yeah, I think some of you know who I am. I'm an analytical chemist by training and came to New York by way of Manitoba, where I spent 10 years at the Canadian Grain Commission, which was Canada's regulatory, basically quality assurance agency for Western Canadian grain. I worked in malting barley, but they also did wheat, which was sort of king, canola, which was the second most popular grain. So 25 million tons of wheat produced in Western Canada, 15 million tons of canola. I'd like to say 10 million tons of barley, which was true when I started there in 2005. It's more like 7 or 8 million tons of barley, of which about 2 million is selected for malting and brewing. 1 million is exported mostly to China, and 1 million tons malted domestically. So learned my trade there and then brought that knowledge here to New York to establish the first really quality testing, third-party quality testing lab for grain and malt quality in the U.S. Prior to 2015, there was really nowhere that a small craft malt house could send their grain or malt for testing because there was no demand really prior to that. So we did this. We built the center at Hartwick College, and our goal is to support growth and innovation in the farm brewing, farm distilling value chain. So we really have this value chain starting to build in the 2000s and now moved across almost every state. There is some desire to produce a beer or a spirit from a locally grown ingredient. And so that is not too difficult if you're in a sort of a modernly traditional growing area, but it can be quite difficult if you're in a re-emerging area like the Northeast or the Southeast or even the Pacific Northwest, where malting barley hadn't been a commodity crop for the last few decades. So how we do that is primarily through our technical support. So in our fee-for-service laboratory, we've got about 40 different tests that cover a range of quality parameters, and we're supporting maybe at the moment like over 450 businesses. Most of those are malt houses and farms, because really I believe that to have a really high quality beer or spirit, you have to start with quality raw ingredients. That's the key. So our grain quality lab, very much the one that you guys have in Michigan, modeled after our lab, which is great. Offers testing primarily for barley, but we do wheat, oats, rye, corn, anything, sorghum lately, some interesting gluten-free ingredients, following the sort of standardized methods of the ASBC, so we can help both help grain growers understand the quality of their crop and use that for marketing purposes and for learning to improve their processes and give them some feedback. And then for end users to make sure that they're bringing in only the best quality. And then we work with the craft malt houses to determine the quality of their finished malt, mostly for their own process improvement, and so they can articulate their malt quality to brewers. So, and we started with sort of basic malt analysis, but we've sort of expanded in the last few years with some, at the bottom here, some tests that are really specific for the interests of distillers. So we have areas of this country where they have peat, actually in Washington. And so we're doing the phenol assays for the peated malts, predicted spirit yield, which is sort of the way that that distillers think about efficiency, and glycosic nitrile, which is an anti-quality factor in malting barley that we look at. And then with our free time, of course, when we're not analyzing client samples, we engage in research collaborations. And this is really the most fun part. So the research collaborations, whether it be with agronomists, agronomy and extension teams like yourselves, or plant breeders at some of the other universities, public and private plant breeding that's going on, where we really want to look at, improving grain quality, maximizing functional properties and now even maybe sensory properties of ingredients, process optimization. So how do I make malt that meets the needs of my brewers with this variety or that variety, or perhaps something like sorghum or something else. And even now some novel uses, we're seeing a lot of increased interest in sprouting. Really a malt house is a sprouting operation. And so looking at sprouting grains for flour and baking, we can do a lot of novel things. I thought today we would talk a little bit about rye. It's pertinent to some of the research you guys are doing well, and we're looking forward to collaborating. And this is something that has really started to become increasingly popular in the craft, both in craft beer and spirits. Rye is actually, historically, there was a lot of rye whiskey in the Northeast, Pennsylvania. These states have a long history of brewing rye whiskey. And I think we're seeing a bit of resurgence in the interest of rye whiskeys, and that's driving the questions, which are, okay, how do we grow select varieties and manage a rye crop for end use quality? You guys know that rye is pretty old cereal grain, so there's a long history of cultivation. There are spring and winter types, although mostly we're seeing winter types in production throughout like the Northeast, certainly Midwest and upper Midwest. It's free threshing, so that's a bonus. It's the most hardy of the winter grains, so it's typically hardier than winter wheat, which is again hardier than winter barley. So we get rye growing all the way up into winter rye growing all the way up into like Manitoba, where we certainly wouldn't even think to try winter barley. But that open pollination means it's a bit tricky with respect to maintaining varietal purity. And it has a multitude of end uses, right? So there's obviously the feed end uses, both in the grain and in the forage. Long history, and especially in Europe, of food uses for bread, both leavened and unleavened bread. Gets grown a lot for agronomic reasons, cover cropping and reasons like that. Long history of both brewing and distilling, different styles, and probably some industrial uses too. There are rye breeding programs in both in North America and globally. So Agriculture Canada is breeding rye. Hazlitt is a big name variety that occupies a lot of acres in Canada. The US has some both public and private breeding programs, and internationally there are some breeding programs, of which the KWS hybrid breeding program is doing a really good job in marketing their varieties in the US. So we're seeing a lot of acres going into the hybrids. Big advantages in terms of agronomics. We see big yields, but also actually in terms of quality. So that's I think a double bonus there. When we're thinking about selecting rye for malting and brewing end use, we get the same questions that we get for malting barley, but I think the answers don't come as quickly, right? So, we can all list now pretty well what we know we need to look for when we're identifying high quality barley for malting, right? We know the protein range, we know that it should be, we know that the grains have to germinate well, we know we're looking for free of disease, grain plumpness, but which of these really translate into brewing and distilling performance of rye? I don't think it's as obvious. Obviously, low moisture content for the same reason, to prevent grain spoilage. Plump kernels tend to be more desirable, can be associated with higher test weights. Obviously, for these food uses, we need to be free of disease, and rye is susceptible to fusarium. Actually, so we see really bad problems with dawn in rye. So we need good disease control. And a problem we see with rye that we don't see as much in wheat or barley is ergotism. And so we have to be really careful about ergot. And we do see a lot of ergot in the rye, primarily when the rotational practices aren't good. So we discourage people from growing grasses after grasses, which it tends to give us the ergot problem. So ergot shouldn't be as much of a problem if you have a robust rotational strategy. But at the end of the day, I don't think we know as well that these are the best predictors for end use processing. And none of these things typically necessarily tell us very much about flavor. And that is a question that's of a lot of importance in craft, and frankly in all brewing and distilling, which is that, this is a customer experience, isn't as much driven by functionality. The customer experience is driven by flavor. So we'd like to be able to answer that question as well when it comes up. When we're brewing with rye, I always say, well, when you brew with rye, it's not going to make brewing any easier, right? It only makes brewing harder. For any of you who've brewed with rye, without the husk, actually, rye has a high extract potential. I mean, it's not necessarily a source of extract when used in small proportions, but it does have a lot of extract that's available, and that's correlated with low protein, just like it is with barley and wheat. And when we malt rye, we actually get very high levels of diastatic enzymes. So you can get a lot of alpha amylase and a lot of DP. So there is some conversion power there. Where brewing with rye really becomes problematic is in the wort separation step, right? The rye, due to its biochemical makeup, has very high viscosity. We're talking about, it can get very thick. And because the cell wall constituents are not beta-glucan, they're primarily pentosan polymers, so like we call arabinoxylans, these are not degraded to the same extent when we malt, right? So we know when we malt barley, we get a huge reduction in cell wall, in the cell wall matrix. Beta-glucan is degraded significantly, but actually that's not the same. And Paul Schwartz has done some great research, and this is actually all published, that looked at, over the course of malting, at different moisture levels and different days of germination, that the decrease in arabinoxylan was not very significant. So, viscosities, maybe bringing the viscosity down from 5 to 4, or 3, but nowhere near, the 1.5 that you might expect from a well-modified barley malt. So this is where exogenous enzymes are very helpful. And actually all of the distilling, basically that's going on is using exogenous enzymes to break down those non-starch polysaccharides and improve lautering performance or wort separation. And also to free starch. Most of this, actually a lot of the distilling is not, they're doing on mash fermentation. So they're not concerned about wort separation, but they do need to access the starch. And then attenuation. So actually rye worts can be well attenuated and bring along a lot of the positive factors that are correlated with attenuation, like fan and diastatic power. In distilling, one of the primary functional process variables is spirit yield. So whereas a brewer tends to measure initial gravity and focus a lot on gravity for extract, distilling, a primary measure for these guys is yield, spirit yield. So how much alcohol are they getting per ton of grain or malt? And that's how we report this. And we can measure this in the laboratory. It's essentially the product of extract and fermentability. So if we do a laboratory mash, okay, where we simulate the mashing step on the benchtop, and then we do a laboratory fermentation, usually a forced fermentation, so we can finish that process in 24 or 48 hours. Then we put those two numbers together to give us the spirit yield. So the higher the extract, well, obviously the more yield, the spirit yield you'll get. And so it's positively correlated with extract, typically negatively correlated with grain protein, and positively correlated with fermentability. So the more fermentable the wort is, the more spirit yield you'll get. So we had the opportunity to get our hands on a variety, a uniform nursery trial from Minnesota. So we had the same handful of varieties grown at 3 different locations in Minnesota. And so this is our first opportunity to ask the question, what are the genetic and environmental differences that we can see in quality with rye? And there was very little, a dearth of literature on this topic. We couldn't really say. So this was good. You can see the list of varieties that were included in the trial, including some really popular ones, Hazlitt and Brisetto, very popular. These are grain type varieties with big kernels. There's a few in there like the Spooner and the Rustic Rye. These are like forage type varieties with really small kernels. And then we had 3 pretty different locations. You can see here on the left, there was a pretty wide range of kernel sizes, with Brisetto and Hazlitt over on the right with larger kernels, and then some of the forage varieties on the left with really small kernels. And this is over the 7/64, so this is the super plump. We typically see the plumpest grain over the 6/64 being up at like 60 or 65%. If you have 60% plump on a rye, that's a very big kernel in my experience. And then a thin would be like 20 or 30% over the 6. those are pretty thin. And then we looked at grain protein. There was varietal differences in grain protein. So, maybe 3% from the lowest to the highest. So the KW, the hybrids on the left of the graph on the right tend to have low protein. I think that might be some yield dilution effect, right? When these are grown all with the same amount of nitrogen, the hybrids are big yielders. And so they tend to have a bit of dilution effect on the protein. When we went on to look at the extract and fermentability of that extract, you can see we saw the range again, a pretty big range, a significant variety effect on extract and on fermentability. And again, the hybrids created very fermentable wort. So you can see those over on the right. And then when we put extract and fermentability together for that product, we see this which varieties really shone in terms of spirit yield. So these are the varieties that we would expect to be the most efficient in the distillery. So that was Daniello, Brasetto, the hybrids, and Hazlitt. Hazlitt seems to always do very well. So the units there are, you can see around 400. That would be 400 liters of absolute alcohol, so 200 proof alcohol per ton of grain. And sort of like extract in malt, this is a maximum theoretical extract. So the difference between what they achieve in the distillery and this would be sort of the measure of efficiency. One of the relationships that was the strongest in the data set was the negative correlation between predicted spirit yield and grain protein. So this right away, a strong correlation there suggests that we should be managing and selecting grain for low protein in rye. And that really improves the spirit yield in the distillery. So I think that's an important finding. We get asked a lot about flavor, and this is something historically we haven't been looking a lot at. And so when we started to think about, well, what varieties of rye or management strategies produce more flavorful spirits, we first have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by more flavorful, right? That's kind of a subjective idea. So we started looking through the literature and talking to master distillers about what compounds are desirable. And I think, those of you who are aficionados of rye whiskey know that it's the spicy notes, the spicy character in rye that really gives it that punch. And that is desirable. So when we think about the spicy compounds, chemically, those compounds are mostly phenolic compounds. And one of the most prominent is one called the 4-vinyl guaiacol. So we're just going to call that 4VG. So 4-vinyl guaiacol is a clove, kind of has a clove aroma on its own. And it's in that spicy category. So this is actually produced by the yeast. It's a compound of a result of yeast metabolism. And the yeast, we're kind of working backwards here, but the yeast, the precursor compound is called ferulic acid. So the ferulic acid is taken up by the yeast and metabolized into this 4-vinyl guaiacol. So where does this ferulic acid come from? Well, the ferulic acid is bound in the arabinose island polymers, which form the primary cell wall constituent of the rye. So mechanistically, this all makes sense. So we have the ferulic acid released during the mashing process, typically through the action of enzyme, the endogenous ferulic acid esterase, which is there to some extent in the rye, but actually there's quite a bit in the malt, in malted barley. So in a mash bill that's comprised of, some proportion of unmalted rye and some proportion of malted barley, we see this synergistic effect where the ferulic acid esterase from the malted barley helps release ferulic acid from the rye. And then that ferulic acid is then converted into 4VG, somewhat through thermal decomposition, perhaps in boiling, but then primarily through enzymatic action of the yeast itself. And so we decided that we would take this 4VG compound and use that as a chemical flavor marker for the spicy character. And then what that allows us to do is take this variety trial, for instance, and say, okay, can we identify flavor differences or potential flavor differences? So we use a mashing profile that looks a bit like this. It was a grain bill that's 85% rye, raw rye grain and 15% of a high diastatic malt. And we also use some viscofirm enzyme, which is essentially arabinoxylenase and beta-glucanase to liquefy and break down the cell wall parameter. So we do that, and then we follow this mashing profile where we have 45-degree mash in for 30 minutes, holding there, and that's sort of our ferulic acid esterase rest. That enzyme is not heat stable, so we spend some time at a low temperature, and then we come up to conversion temperature and we hold at 70 degrees for 1 hour. After we separate, we do a benchtop fermentation for 44 hours with a distilling strain of yeast, and then we take that beer, I guess you can call it, and we use HPLC to just separate and quantify the 4VG compound. So reverse phase, nothing too fancy there. It's a UV absorber, the compound, so we have UV detection. And then it's a little bit small, but we've got a very nice linear calibration. We can buy 4VG standard, and we've got from basically from 0.1 to 20 parts per million. So we've got a nice big range that's straight, and you can see there we have a nice peak, resolved from other peaks for 4VG. And then when we went and looked at all the samples, the 10 varieties from the 3 different locations, there were differences. It was like, okay, great. So when we see differences, we start to ask the question, okay, so what is the nature of these differences? What is responsible for these differences? So when we looked statistically and break down all the variation in terms of the genotypes and the locations, both were significant. So on the left, we can see significant differences among the varieties in the levels of 4VG. Not quite twofold, but almost, right? A twofold from the lowest to the highest. In this particular study, the KWS varieties, the hybrids were a bit on the more moderate side. I wouldn't say this was low, but based on some of our survey work, 4VG levels around 7 to 10 are sort of moderate. And then we had a couple of varieties that rustic actually, which was very high in this case. So that was interesting. And then when we just put it all back together and sorted it by location, the locations were also significantly different. So really this tells us that potentially the varietal choice could have an impact on flavor, but also the environment. So where it was grown or management. So, kind of intriguing outcomes there. I think where that leaves us to go next is one, we're looking forward to working with you guys to bring this a little bit further east. So getting into the Midwest with Michigan would be great. I'd love to do, get my hands on some samples from New York or New England so we could move that even further east. And see what sort of relationships we're seeing there. Maybe going a little bit back, this is a lot of work, to do a mashing and a fermentation. Could we go back and say, well, could we just look at a grain attribute? It's always a bit easier if there was something in the grain that would predict this. So if we measured just the arabinoxylen content of the grain or even the ferulic acid in the grain, could we get similar predictive information a little bit without doing so much benchtop simulation? And then these sensory attributes depend highly on many other factors. So we know that different yeast strains, I'm almost positive, would have an impact. So choosing yeast strains in order to maximize certain sensory outcomes, the fermentation conditions themselves, distillation conditions, process, and then is there a trade-off between flavor and processability? Like, was it a coincidence that our highest yielding varieties weren't necessarily had the highest amount of the flavor marker? I think that might be the case, right? Sometimes there are trade-offs. When you have a smaller kernel with a less large starchy endosperm, maybe then as a percentage or, you have more of the type of compounds that lead to flavor. So I think that's an interesting question, does it have to be a trade-off? Sort of that. So that's what we're thinking about next is where could we go to look at this in another predictive way and what other variables, lend themselves to creating flavor, which is desired. So that is a little bit of an insight into some of our rye research themes right now, and looking forward to collaborating and happy to sort of round it out with some discussion now.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Aaron. We have a question and a comment in the chat from Brooke, but Brooke, do you just want to go ahead and ask those, or do you want me to read them off?
No, I'll just ask and I'll go backwards. So just a comment, I'm really excited about your flavor marker data there, because I noticed in one of our plots that was just individual big blocks where we had a Roostuk and a couple other varieties, the birds or deer or something just ate a lot of the Roostuk and like stopped at the border of the next variety. And it was really interesting because it was probably about a 1 acre plot, and literally I think half of it or so, we probably lost 50% of our yield in the Roostuk. Very interesting, like seeing your Roostuk stand out on that profile and that chart. I don't know, you want to comment on that?
I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Using the birds as a predictive tool. That's a cool idea. Once we used to see that with there is types of hooded barley that actually have either no awns or they're barbless awns. It wasn't something like that, was it? Wasn't something physical about the nature of the heads?
I didn't look close enough to.
Yeah. So when I think about the animals sort of selective feeding, sometimes I think about, at least in the barley model, the awns, that sort of thing. But yeah, that's a cool idea, right? Like these compounds have some purpose, right? Maybe they're great. So sometimes I think of it the other way, right? Like we know, for instance, when we're looking at cyanogenic compounds in grains, well, there's some anti-pest, right? Why would grain have cyanide? Like, why would the plant do that? Well, maybe it's some anti-pest thing. And when we start to breed, when we breed for specific things, if you breed that out, does that mean that the grain could become more susceptible to pests? I mean, I worry about that. I worry about that kind of thing. So I don't know.
There could also
birds
be some
can tell.
Phenology related reasons as well. If one is, ripening or sooner than another one. I've seen that with corn, for example.
Yeah, a rootstock is supposedly one of the earliest maturing rye varieties out there. I mean, at least that's, if you look through a lot of the literature, you hear anything 7 to 10 days earlier maturing than other varieties of rye, which is part of the reason why it's popular for cover crops, particularly people that want to do the roller crimping. They want it to mature earlier in the season so that they can crimp it earlier and use it. But that's predominantly in the cover crop world. That's what a rootstock's known for.
So my other question was, should we be using a different screen size to measure plumpness in rye?
We were playing around. I don't think necessarily. I think that we still get when I'm thinking about phenotyping, I want to choose a test that pulls the range apart, right? So that's why we did a little bit of experimentation with the 7 to say, well, look, could we even see a more dramatic difference among the varieties? And it looked a little bit more dramatic, but it actually pissed off a couple of people, right? Who were like, oh, our grain is plumper than that, which is, so now I kind of regret doing it the 7 because people are used to the 6. So no, I think we would stick. It's just that it made it a little bit more of a dramatic difference. That's all.
Are there implications for malting rye? And I think maybe Vince, if you're still here, you could weigh in on this too. I think that was a little bit part of a conversation we had in terms of actual size, or is just the relative size most important?
Yeah, hi guys.
Hey Vince.
Hey, Vince.
I was actually going to comment because that's a really good question and a good lead in. So, and Aaron already knows what I'm going to say. Right. So for me as a maltster, if I'm going to use this rye to make what I consider to be like the greatest rye malt that exists in the world, which is exactly what I want to do with it. I want to hit 100% on 7. All right. I'll take 100% on 7. And I know that that's not possible, but I'll tell you what, there are a lot of varieties out there, depending on where they're grown, that are going to give you really dang close to 100% on 7. We're talking 90. You might find 90%, but it's really a marriage of the variety with the with the growing area. That's been my experience.
I think it comes down to practical purposes too. Some people, Vince, how relevant is it in a pneumatic system? You do have to worry about the wedge wire floor, right? Like you do have, there's some minimum size by which if the kernels are too small, they'll fall through.
That's absolutely true. Look, all I'm getting with plumpness is the ability to have better, or the ability to make additional adjustments on my malt mill to hit the perfect grind. That's all I'm getting. I'm not telling you I'm going to get the perfect grind, but I'm telling you that if I have the ability to do that with my mill, the plumper one will give me the best result. That's what I'm saying. So, and really, it's it's all about it's all about you know, you can't have like 90% huge and then 10% crap, you know, because you're basically gonna lose that 10% crap, so you're not gonna get good stuff out of your mill anyway, you know. So it's got to be homogeneous, you know. So
yeah, that's kind of.
So I like using on 7 because, like you already said, it's dramatic. You can see the difference, you know. I mean, it pops some varieties out, but you know, quite frankly, those numbers are going to go up and down with that variety year after year after year. You know, it's just a number. I like to use them. I like to use them just as an indicator, you know, compared to everybody else where you're at. And I figure if you use that number as an indicator, compare everybody else where you're at. As long as you don't use one number alone, you have to use all the numbers together, right? But you know, if I got that option to use that number, I'm going to jump on it. And certainly that, to me, that's a very important one.
I guess to dig into this, my thinking a little bit more is, you know, seeing 20% on that 7 screen, I'm wondering, well, what's left? So is the remaining 80% a 6, or are there some that are 3, you know? And with barley, if you get 90 on, you know, on the 7 screen, then like, okay, well, the rest of the 10, like, probably are going to be smaller, and it's a small proportion, but you know, you don't really know what's left with a 20.
Brooke, I think you make the good point, which is that this way that we measure the kernel size using the screens is not a measure of the average kernel size. It's really a measure of the distribution, right? And so we can't equate plumpness measured on any screen, 6 or 7, with being equivalent to the average kernel size. You could have 2 samples with the same plumpness, right? Which is really just a distribution, and very different average kernel size.
Right.
And that's true. And then also you can have the same plumpness with dramatically different on 7s, right? But if you hold those grains in your hand, one is going to look really beautiful and the other one is going to look so beautiful. And to me, that's the bottom line, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. So you have to use all the numbers, right? You can't just say, I'm going to target that one number, right? You got to, if I'm going to use on 7, I definitely got to use on 7 plus 6 as well, right? And I got to use through, because there's no reason to be pushing a variety is going to give you 10, 20, 30% throughs, no matter, you know, what it's giving you on 7s, right?
So 2 take-home messages from that I get are, 1, we really need to see all of the sets, right? We need to see 5, 6, and 7 and through.
Well,
so
I do.
See a distribution. Well, I know Vince does. And you can't solve a plumpness problem by scalping. People always say to me, oh, it's, you know, it's in the barley world, right? Like 81% plump is not fantastic. They say, oh, I'll just save what's over the 6 and I'll lose 20%. Well, yes, but overall, on average, these kernels are still quite small. Yeah. So because it's a distribution measurement, not an average size measurement, just scalping it and throwing away the 20% didn't make the grain any plumper. It didn't solve the problem.
So I don't know if I followed all this because my chemistry sucks, but
this is physics.
Yeah, no, I'm going back to so you said that the ferulic acid comes from the hull, right?
No, from the cell wall, not the wall, outer wall. It's actually the cell walls within the endosperm.
Oh, okay. Because I was wondering, because the rootstock was smaller kernels, do you have more cell wall, and is that basically what's leading to the higher level of 4VG?
I think that's related, right? We just, those, even if it's the outer layers maybe have a bit higher concentration of the arabinoxylan. And imagine these cells, right? You might have the same number of cells, but they're not as big, right?
Yeah.
So even if we imagine one cell, if you have a big fat cell, then the ratio of starch to cell wall is much larger than in a little small cell. I think, Dean, that's a very plausible, hypothesis, right? And I think we see similar, or hear, I should say, similar things in the barley world, right? Why is it that they love the flavor of some old high protein thin variety like Maris Otter? Oh, we love the flavor. Yeah, because, right, this is like 78% extract, right? So you have more husk, you have more aileron, you have more of these other components. Whereas you think of a big, fat, starchy Metcalf, it's all starch. So I think that's plausible. And we, 6-row, smaller kernels. Oh, you taste that grainy flavor. Yeah, that seems plausible.
Yeah,
So
6-row is a 4-letter word. Brewers.
So
They want flavor.
How
but
did
not
your
6-row.
size? How did your size differences come out by location from that Minnesota data?
I don't remember, Dean, but that's a good follow-up question. Yeah, so you're saying, is there a easy correlation between like size and 4VG, or just the locations with the smaller size have the highest 4VG?
Yeah.
It's a good question. So we need to do all the correlations. You're right. We need to do all the correlations.
I mean, that might be a quick and dirty. It might not be definitive, but it might be a quick and dirty that would get you to another test.
Yes. Are you offering your services, your statistician services to us?
Oh, you don't even want to go there. You think if my chemistry is bad, my statistics are worse.
Mine are a little rusty too. So yeah,
man.
we need to do some more correlation analysis.
So I have a question about cyanogenic material in rye. Is glycosidic nitrile a consideration that we should be aware of with rye, or is it a no-go?
Luckily, we're good there. So we have screened a lot of ryes and a lot of wheats, and they do not produce epiheterodendron. So all the ryes that we've looked at so far are non-GN.
That's excellent.
The other thing I'll remind you, Ryan, is that GN is only synthesized during germination. So even unmalted barley is non-GN. So anytime you're working with raw grains, they're not bringing any GN into the picture. That all of the GN is really brought in by the malted barley, and that's why it's of particular concern in all malt whiskey and of lesser concern in grain whiskeys where malted barley forms only a small proportion of the mash bill. In fact, in our benchtop trial, I chose 15% malt just because I don't know why. It seemed like a reasonable amount. But after talking to a lot of distillers, most of them are using less, like 10% or even 5% malted barley.
Well, that kind of explains why the concern over GN and ethyl carbamate seems to be coming from Scotch distillers and
You're
single
correct.
malt whiskeys.
So America has almost no long history of malt whiskey production, right? We're a grain whiskey producing nation, the bourbons and the ryes, Canada too. It was really the Scots that discovered the problem because they were the ones doing 100% malt whiskeys. Yeah, absolutely. So America hasn't been a problem till just recently. Still is actually not currently regulated in the US. It's regulated in export markets. But the distilleries who are kind of, paying the closest attention, I would say, are doing their own due diligence. But currently, there is no regulation on ethyl carbamate in spirits in the US. I assume it'll come probably first in California.
Yeah, UC Davis has a safety manual for ethyl carbamate that's very thick.
Good.
I recommend not printing that.
No. Okay.
Because you've tried.
Oh, I did print it. Yeah, because I'm a nerd.
Is 4VG volatile?
Yes. Anything you can smell
That's
is
what
volatile.
I figured. If it's if it's that clovey,
Mm-hmm.
is as much a smell as it is a taste.
It's absolutely an aroma compound. And so what I like to say is that aromas exist only in air, right? They don't exist in liquid. To smell something, you don't inhale the liquid, right? it exists in the space above the liquid, what we call the head space. So yeah, absolutely volatile. We would like to do more. So the next, actually only this week, Hartwick College has hired a new a visiting professor of analytical chemistry with some good GC experience, gas chromatography.
Cool.
If you want to go after volatiles, you really have to be in the gas chromatography world. And we already talked about this. We're going to take our fermented washes and maybe even some distillates. We have 4 glass alembic benchtop stills. So we could distill if we needed to, which would help, right? Because it really concentrates the volatiles, and stick these into the GC, which has a head space. And it also has what's called SPME, a solid phase microextraction. So head space means the injection to the gas chromatograph doesn't go into the liquid. It just goes into the air above the liquid. So it's really just picking up volatiles, like the ones we want. But if they're not very concentrated, then it can be hard to pick them up and move and stick them in the machine. So the SPME, the solid phase microextraction, instead of putting the injector to pull up air, it puts this microfiber into the headspace and leaves it there for 20 minutes, 40 minutes, and it's absorptive. And all the volatiles absorb into this little fiber. Imagine like a pipe cleaner. And then it puts that into the instrument, and they desorb into the instrument. So it's a way to concentrate the volatiles to increase the detection limit. And we're going to take some of these, maybe even yours, if the rye washes. Wash is what the distillers call beer, right? So after they ferment the mash, they have this wash or beer. And then we're going to take those and stick them in the GC and see if we can find even more compounds. The problem with HPLC, the way we do it is we don't have a universal detector. So if we want to identify a compound, we have to have a perfect, pure example of it, which is okay. I can buy 4VG, from a chemical company for $30, a little bottle. But, I can't buy all the ones that I want, right? And so I can't identify it. And so when we see our chromatogram come out of the HPLC, it separates the volatiles. There's a bunch of peaks I don't know what they are. I don't know what they are. So with the GCMS, the universal detector will say, based on the weights of these compounds, molecular whatevers, my analytical chemistry is not that great either on instrumental, it'll tell us what they are. So it's more universal. So I think then we can start branching off into other directions. We're not sure yet that, this one compound is the be all and end all, and that it's correlated with all of the sensory outcomes. We're just saying more 4VG, more spicy character. That's all we're really saying. Stay tuned for more. We'll try to do more, or collaborate. Like if that's something that you guys have, that Nicole has, then I think this is where we really want to collaborate and work to our strengths, right? Like Ryan was commenting on the recent proliferation of labs that all want to do this kind of work, which is great. We need more infrastructure and we need more resources, but we don't necessarily need more duplication. Right. So, we've got the micro malting, we've got the bench scale mashing. If someone else has the advanced analytics, I'd be happy at that point to send the samples off to the next collaborator and really leverage expertise instead of, like we do now, right? Like you guys can grow the stuff. We could do some of the benchtop work and then maybe get a collaborator to do the advanced analytics.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dean, I don't know if you're familiar with German wheat beers, but 4VG gives them that cloak character. That's kind of like if you want to go find a textbook example in the marketplace, like a Hefeweizen beer from Germany will have that clove character, and also like banana bubblegum, which is from the other main flavor component that we identify from that, which is an ester called isoamyl acetate. Yeah, still remember that. Okay.
Very good.
Anyone on the call still have any questions?
I have one more if I could. I guess I'm just thinking, I was struck by the relationship between spirit yield and grain protein and how strong that relationship was. And sorry, I think, some politician is calling my phone here. So hold on. Well, is it okay or is it loud?
It's okay.
What can we do to like move that line up, so that we we can bring up grain yields for the farmer, but still have high spirit yields and lower proteins. Thoughts there, Aaron? Have you done any correlations with the yields they got from that Minnesota study?
No, I didn't have the agronomic data. So this is something that you'll be in a better position to
Right.
do if you have differences in protein. So we were lucky there that there were differences in protein both among the varieties and the location. So it was highly structured, right? Like you only see those like 80% correlations in highly structured data, right?
Yeah.
So, but that seemed obvious for the same reason that low grain protein promotes high malt extract. I think it was an obvious relationship. Now it was a bit wild, the 80%, because it's highly structured population. I think to answer your question, it's the same. That's the same nut that we have to crack in barley management, or like Vince would remind us, in wheat management, right? As you apply more nitrogen, you get better yield, but only to a point, right? You know that. You don't just keep getting yield and yield. There is a plateau. And so at some point, right, you want to maximize yield while also maximizing quality. So with that extra constraint, where's the sweet spot, right? But I don't think I mean, you're the agronomy guys, but there's always going to be a trade-off, right? Like at some point you're getting the protein you want, and maybe you wouldn't have gotten that much more yield anyway, right? So
we see the same type of relationship in actually dairy feed, where we look at metrics like milk per ton of feed, like as an output, if you feed the cows this much, and then we look at it milk per acre, which accounts for quality and yield, and then the farmer kind of has to choose, like, do I want to go for volume that may have a lower quality, or do I really want to push for the highest quality, but maybe this is so it's just reminding me that we have the similar conversations in multiple agricultural enterprises.
yes, but I would like to make the farmer more of my partner in that. I would encourage the industry to make the farmer a partner and not make the farmer have to choose. So for example, if we want the farmer to specifically manage it under low N and they're going to get less yield, I think you should pay them a premium so that they get the same dollars per acre, because a farmer doesn't actually care about yield. They only think they do. They don't care about bushels per acre. What they care about is dollars per acre.
Right.
So I think that we should be maximizing the dollars per acre, at least for them, and saying, fine, we understand that we want you to manage under low N, and we'll pay you to do that so that their dollars per acre comes out the same.
I agree. In the milk situation, usually the farmer is the end user, so they're one and the same. But I completely agree that
I'll tell you an anecdote if you have time for a demonstrative anecdote. So Western Canada has the problem there is high protein, right? It's dry land cultivation, right, in the prairies, and Canadian barley is known for relatively high protein. So the plant breeders, they attack this problem head on, right? That is certainly something that there's a genetic aspect. And the plant breeders in 20 years did a really good job, from Metcalf to like AAC Connect or Synergy, like a variety that's only a couple years old. They brought the protein down by 1%. And what we saw was that the first year that a grower who'd been growing Metcalf grew Synergy, they got 1% lower protein. And everyone in the industry was super happy. And then because their spec didn't change, right? The spec is, deliver protein at less than 12.5. Well, what they were with bringing in their Metcalf year after year at like 12.4, because the farmer is going to maximize their management. They're going to make sure they can put on as much fertilizer as they can without exceeding that protein spec. And then they switched over to Synergy and they got 1% lower protein the first year. And what do you think happened the second year? Well, they figured it out. And it went away. And they're like, oh, this is great. We're going to put on more nitrogen. And they did. And the industry lost its advantage, right? Because we didn't incentivize them the right way. We should have said, but if you bring it in under 11%, 11.5% protein, we'll give you an extra, whatever, $1 a ton or something. They'll figure it out, Brooke. They're too smart.
I agree. Thank you.
Make them our partner. Let's make them our partner.
Well, we got to get the breeders in on it too, because a lot of times these things are at odds with what the breeders are breeding for. I found the same thing with the organic soybean. what's prized for organic soybeans for tofu and soy milk is protein and oil content. But those tend to be inversely related to yield. So the breeders, you know, if you weren't looking at those two markets and you were just breeding soybeans, you wouldn't care. You go for the high yield animal, which basically in the organic world is giving you a animal grade soybean because it's high in yield, but it's also low in protein and oil. So sometimes I think our breeders need to be pounded on to work on the right combination.
They certainly need a clear signal from their end use. And if they're, my experience is like a typical small grains breeder is not thinking about end use normally. They're thinking about maximizing outcomes for growers, which is their absolutely
maximize yield and minimize disease.
Right. But if you compare that to like a malting barley breeder, someone who's only spent their life in malting barley, they listen to AMBA, right? AMBA is an organization that sends very clear signals to breeders about what to breed for. And a successful end use breeder is not the same thing as like a small grains breeder. So absolutely. But I think plant breeders are like genius, right? Because you just give them a few criteria, right? Like as long as there's a clear signal about what they want, a genetic difference exists, right? There has to be some genetic differentiation and a way to measure it. If you give them those three things, they can always do it. So it can take time, but they can always do it.
I went to the website for the seed bank because I was thinking about all this stuff related to cereal rye and cover crops. There are over 1,900 varieties of cereal rye in the seed bank right now, from all over Europe. You know, so there's a lot of material out there. Sometimes I think if we could get someone to pony up the money to just do a basic screening of what's in there, you might find some real gems.
Yeah, small grains collection in Idaho.
This is the overall seed bank where they store all the different types of crops.
I think you guys grew that. Didn't you grow that 100 lines from Chris Rideout, the Barley Brook? Didn't you and Ashley and them, weren't you involved in that somehow? It was a big screen, wasn't it?
Ashley and Chris, I think, were involved before I was heavily involved. Yeah, but
yeah, those were all spring lines from the UK, though, weren't they? Did they include?
But like, what came of it?
I don't know.
I don't know that we had any grand conclusions for our area other than providing, data to the larger project.
Okay.
I think so. Don't know. Good question. Maybe we should figure that out. I'll get on the phone with Ashley. Hey, where's this publication?
I think projects need clearly defined objectives, right? I think right now in the rye, I'd be particularly interested in management, right? Nitrogen trial for rye, and maybe harvest timing.
We'll work on it.
Once we identify the variety, which you're already doing in your uniform trial.
Right. Well, we have blocks of varieties planted out at both of the farms to do undetermined management trials next year. So we should spend some time thinking about that.
Yeah.
Nitrogen for sure, I would say.
Okay. I gotta
What are you thinking on the harvest timing? Give me a little more.
I just think in all I'll give you an example from malting barley. So right now we're seeing that pre-harvest sprout damage is a big risk in malting barley in the east. I assume it is in Michigan too, if you typically get rain during the harvest period. And so what we're encouraging growers to do is to harvest earlier, right? To get the barley out of the field at a higher moisture level, right? I mean, it's mature, but it's like 20% moisture, and do post-harvest drying. And we know that if that's done, that we prevent a lot of pre-harvest sprout damage. The problem is that we're hearing back from the growers is, but there's a lot of green seeds. They see a lot of green, interspersed, and because there's non-uniform emergence and the field isn't maturing early. But I'm like, yeah, how bad is that really? We don't know. So I'd like someone to do an agronomic trial where they force the earlier harvest when there's some green still in there, so that we can get that into the lab, look at the quality, and see if it actually matters, right? Because we want to make sure that the farmers are taking cues on things that actually matter. Like, I'll tell you, it'll be way worse if it's, if the RVA is 10 than if it's harvested a little early and there's a few green kernels in there. Or maybe we just need to know. So I think that's why I'm thinking about harvest timing. We just need more data to show us that what's the right management, what's the right management.
Well, do we know how to dry it without hurting something else?
We absolutely do. So this is an approach that, while not very common, particularly with small grains in North America, it's been used in Europe and in England for decades, right? So historically, the maltsters in England wouldn't be malting during harvest. They'd be using their kilns to dry the barley, right? And so they would bring in the harvest, load it just into the kiln, and in one day, just using low heat drying, so maximum temperatures, let's say, of applied air at like 100 or 110 degrees Fahrenheit, they would be able to drop that barley to under 12% just in one day. So they could do 7 turns in their kiln, just take a little break from malting. And we see very good outcomes where we dry the barley, and they still do this in the UK, but with dryers, purpose heated air dryers with low heat. And what it does is, drying the grain has so many beneficial properties, right? So for every 2% that you can lower the grain moisture, you double the safe storage time. So if you go from 14%, that malting barley will probably hold its germination depending on the temperature for, like, say, a year, right? 6 months to a year. But if you go to 12%, you get 2 years of storability. And that's really important. It's also beneficial for pests, insects, right? There's a sort of level of moisture that's needed to maintain that insect metabolism. When you lower the moisture of the grain, you buy yourself time on pests. You buy yourself time on microbial reproduction. So drying the grain has many, many benefits, and we're trying to encourage as many growers as we can of malting grade grain to dry their grain post-harvest, even if they're bringing it off at 14, right? Depending on where you are, if you're harvesting in North Carolina in June, and your grain's at 14%, you can't do anything with aeration. The air is saturated with humidity. The air has no productive drying capability, and so they're not able to productively dry until much later into the fall. Meanwhile, the grain's sitting at 14% moisture. So a little bit of heat can go a long way.
Yeah, that's why we're seeing such popularity with the variety Calypso. But the downfall of that is the extended dormancy period. Like profoundly long dormancy period.
Yeah, Odyssey and Calypso both have good dormancy, and they have good pre-harvest sprout protection. And so I like to say, you want to choose a variety for the risks you can't manage. So if you're not able to dry at all, if that's just something you couldn't do, like you're loading directly into super sacks, yes, I would say that you go to Calypso, because you have no choice. That long dormancy will protect you. But then you got to wait it out for the maltose, and that's, the grain is going to have low vigor. The other thing is that it's not the only beneficial reason to harvest early. Like, the longer it stays out there, the more it gets rained on, heavy dews, staining, weathering, and late season mold, right? So one of the biggest problems I see in our grain quality surveying, which is all the submitted samples, is that the biggest mold problems have nothing to do with fusarium, right? Like, people are doing a good job managing fusarium. They're applying fungicides at heading, and that's the last application of fungicide, right? People aren't doing later applications of fungicide. They're doing something on the flag leaf, and then they're coming back with a triazole or a Mirabis and doing it and they're getting good fusarium protection. But then there's a whole host of late season fungus, mostly the plant, the blotches and the alternaria, all that stuff sitting on the grain is terrible. It's terrible for just overall grain quality. And like Vince would say, I think he's off the call, but it doesn't look good. Maybe there's no functional problems, but it makes the malt look terrible. So I think there are even additional benefits to early harvest timing, even than just sprout damage.
Yeah, that was one of the downfall, probably the main downfall of Pinnacle here, was that saprophytic complex of fungi that would stain late in the season. And I saw early harvested Pinnacle that looked fine, but by the time it got to the brewer, they didn't want it because it looked
terrible.
dirty.
I mean, even Rich Horsley, the breeder, would say that they used Pinnacle as their like negative disease check in a trial, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
if the powdery mildew was there, it would hit the pinnacle. So, you know, we know the pinnacle does not stand up well to the disease.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because looking back, Common was a much better choice than Pinnacle, but we only knew that by switching over to Pinnacle.
Conlon has great agronomics, but it's much more challenging to malt, right? It's not an easy modifier, and especially when the protein gets high. And so I just, you know, there are a couple of malt houses out there doing a great job with Conlon. Empire, Allison malts a lot of Conlon. Most of it's around 10.5%, which really makes the modification easier. But, you know, Ryan, you know what it's like to try to modify Conlon at 13%. I mean, it's a difficult task, and malting is hard enough, right? You really need to be choosing varieties that make the malting easier, not harder.
Yeah, Conlon's pretty rough, although when we started seeing droughts during grain fill, like really extended dry periods where we needed that moisture during the growing season, I found when I was at Pilot that Conlon actually performed fairly well. Pinnacle's plumpness and assortment really suffered in those years, but Conlon seemed pretty steady. But that, again, that could be from where it was actually grown, G times E. So
I think you're really lucky that Odyssey is doing well in Michigan, because
it does very well.
It has not done well in New York agronomically, so we can't use it. But I think it has a lot of beneficial properties that, you know, if you can get your head around dormancy and get your head around storing barley for a while before you malt it, maybe a little bit of GA used strategically, you can really get good. You know, we see great outcomes with Odyssey. Plus, it's non-GN, so opening up a whole market for distilling. I'm really happy that it's something available to you guys.
Yeah, it's a nice surprise, like doing my crop walks this year, finding that Odyssey was still legitimately a justifiable top pick for spring. Yeah. Cool. Well, if nobody has anything else, Brooke had to run, but he thanked you for your time and everything, and thanked everyone for being here. If nobody has anything further, I'd like to propose a toast to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Ryan.
And yeah, thanks everybody for being here.